I'm happy to introduce the Right Honourable Henry McLeish. By way of introduction, Mr. McLeish played professional soccer starting at age 15. During that time, he played for Scotland's under-18 professional youth team in a European tournament in Pristina, Kosovo, in the former Yugoslavia. He began his political career in Fife, Scotland in the early 1970s and was elected to the United Kingdom Parliament in 1987. He became a member of the Blair government in 1997. As Minister for Devolution at the Scottish Office from 1997 to 1999, he was instrumental in shaping Scotland's first Parliament, which had been at recess for almost 300 years at that point. Elected to the Scottish Parliament in 1999, he was Minister for Enterprise and Lifelong Learning, and he became the first Minister of Scotland in 2000. In that same year, he became a member of the Privy Council, which is an honour bestowed by Her Majesty the Queen. After 30 years in elected office, Mr. McLeish retired from public service in 2003. During the last few years, he's been a visiting lecturer at universities around the world, including Oklahoma State, Denver University, and the United States Air Force Academy. He's presently a visiting professor of law and liberal arts at Arkansas University. Please join me in welcoming the Right Honourable Henry McLeish.
Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. And first of all, can I just thank the University for the kind invitation to come and address the audience today. You're very lucky because it's a beautiful campus in the most spectacular location that I've ever seen anywhere. And I was with Danny yesterday as we drove up the mountains. And the mountains are spectacular, but at this time of year, the fall colours put you in a different class. So I say that with sincerity. In my classes, I always say that I love America, and then the class knows that I'm going to be hugely insulting and intimidating to the class. But I'll refrain from that today. But I always think it's curious that a small country which is barely recognisable on that map of the world has both given the world so much over the last 200 to 300 years, but also continues to exercise the imagination of people throughout the world as we, in this post-devolution situation after 97, chart a new way forward. And it's just worth remembering that we are a population of 5 million people. Glasgow was the second city of the empire. We had a period between 1740 and 1810, the Enlightenment, where, with just a slight touch of bias, we literally invented the world. There are books with that description. Now, as I said, accounting for a bit of bias, in literature, in science, in history, in education, in politics, in religion, there were so many things that emanated from that point in time where the age of reason took over, where we started to argue and question. And that happened in Scotland. Yes, it happened in Europe, but it was some pride that I carry forward that torch in the sense that Scotland at a point in time gave so much. And of course, your own great country. And with a great act, a great gesture in 1776, we decided to give your country back to you and see what you do with it. Clearly been a huge success. That said, you're a country built on immigration. And a lot of it, in certain parts of America in particular, were Scots and Irish, and sometimes both. We're writing a book just now, a friend of mine who's a Scottish National MSP, about Scottish organisations worldwide. And it's fascinating to think that this small country actually has more organisations worldwide than any other country of the 200 countries that represent the world in the United Nations. So it seems to me, again, putting aside the slight element of bias that may creep into my presentation, that this is a special country. And my thesis this afternoon is simply this. We're a country of world-class talent, a country of world-class resource, and we're now striving to be a world-class leader in the world. That may be a huge ambition, but to me, it can be realisable. So this afternoon, what I'd like to do, ladies and gentlemen, is to take you very briefly. I'm going to try and talk for less than 30 minutes. I often think if you listen to an ex-politician or a politician for more than 30 minutes, you want to just disappear and escape and do something constructive with your life. Let's try and avoid that today. And so we'll have a question and answer session at the end. So what I'd like to try and do is to start with the current constitutional position in Scotland. And most people will know that in 1997 the Blair government was elected. In 1999 the Scottish Parliament was set up. Her Majesty the Queen opened it on July the 1st in 1999. And the Parliament will now be celebrating its 8th birthday next year as the politicians go to the polls in the election. But of some other significance, next year will be the 300th anniversary of the integration of the Scottish Parliament with the British Parliament. For some, ladies and gentlemen, that was described as a sellout. People still say that. Why did we do that? We had merged our crowns in 1603, and 100 years later we were merging our parliaments. In that sense, if you could use the idea of a nation-state in 1707, that now came to an end, and we were incorporated into Britain. So some people thought it was a sellout. Other people thought in the aftermath of some economic disasters in Scotland, this was a practical necessity that had to be taken on board. But next year, when 300 years is celebrated or commemorated on May the 1st, for most Scots, it will just be another piece of history that they either not know a great deal about, and maybe more worrying, are maybe not terribly interested in. So the Parliament exists. The Parliament is a working Parliament. It spends about $60 billion a year. It has major legislative powers in health and education and housing and environment and transport. It legislates for Scotland. When I was an MP in Westminster, it would take maybe 3 or 4 years to have 5 pieces of legislation affecting Scotland pass through that House. In the first year of the Scottish Parliament, there were 17 pieces of legislation. Now, I'm not a great advocate, and I know Americans share this view, that too much legislation could be a bad thing. But we were in a line, as you call it in America, for legislation at Westminster. One of the benefits of Edinburgh, of Holyrood, of a Scottish Parliament is that we could get more of our business done in Scotland, by Scots, for Scots. We're also a new focus for political debate in Scotland in the year 2006, 7 years on from that election. We had 129 new members, many of them with no experience. They've now got nearly 8 years' experience behind them and are doing very well. So in that sense, the Parliament on any objective criteria could be measured a success. But there, of course, a bigger debate which is emerging in terms of devolution is whether we've arrived at a destination or is devolution a journey. Current political debate, in my judgment, is sometimes confused. The Labour Party has members within it who want to see more power for the Scottish Parliament. But they're also linked to a Westminster Labour Party in London. And frankly, the energy and enthusiasm for devolution has died at Westminster. There's no suggestion of devolution within the United Kingdom, i.e. England. And so the Labour Party in Scotland is caught between a status quo position at Westminster and the desire of many to travel further. The SNP, which is the main opposition party in Scotland, the Scottish National Party, for nearly 70 years they have trumpeted the idea of separation, of independence, a seat at the UN, a seat on NATO. Well, for the SNP, they might not want to be in NATO, but certainly a separate country. But my criticism of the SNP is just simply this, that they're trying to sell a product to the Scottish people that no one wants to buy. In most opinion polls, in most elections, they poll 1 in 4 of the population. But on the other hand, my submission to you is that there is another way forward, which will take us further on the journey than Westminster wants, but it will also not take us as far as the SNP might desire at this stage. Because we talk in the past that the whole debate has been about identity, about small n nationalism, about the shadow of England, about how Scotland could do better if it was only alone. But to me, there's a timeline that we now need to embark upon, because much of that debate is outdated, it's old-fashioned. And the reason I say that is simply this. There's a new political space opening up, and devolution created that. And what I'd like to try and do very briefly is to take you through what I regard as the new political space. It has a number of levels, it has a number of challenges, it has a number of important opportunities that Scotland can take, or for a variety of reasons may not wish to take. But if we take then this political space, now 292 years after we had lost our Parliament, we got a new one. That by any definition creates a new space in Scotland, a new Parliament, a new energy, a new focus. But what it also does in a dynamic way is to change the relationship with the United Kingdom. We have some significant powers. And I say unashamedly that what we should be doing is the first political space that has opened up to us is a new relationship with the United Kingdom. That's neither status quo Labourism at Westminster or, from the nationalist point of view, separatism. It is a recognition that there is a pragmatic way forward for Scotland on this journey that needn't be bogged down in ideology of the two major parties. The next space, of course, is Europe. The Europeanisation, the supranationalism that we have in Europe is very significant. I know in America there's often ambivalence, indifference in some parts to the European Union. And it's all about demonising the French, post-Iraq. It's all about French fries, you know. We went through that period in the Congress. But the big issue is that between Europe and the US, 60% of the GDP of the world is generated. And together we are a powerful and potent force. Of course there are tensions at the present time, but some of these can be eased. There are changing political leaders in Europe, and without tempting fate in your country, there may be changing faces in Washington as well. But the main point about Europe is that it is another space. There are 25 nations. We started with 6 in 1958. We're now enlarging. Bulgaria and Romania will come in on January the 1st, 2007. Talks have started with Turkey. Croatia and Macedonia are also in line for discussions. It could be an European Union of 30 to 40 countries over the next 20 or 30 years. But what it also does, it gives a space for subnational governments, i.e. below the nation state. Scotland, Catalonia, Flanders, Bavaria. These are all substantial constitutional legislative units. Of course, Scotland's a nation for me, but in the parlance of Europe and regionalisation, it's a subnational government. So that's another space that we should be exercising more authority. There's a problem. The nation-states in Brussels don't want to cede more powers or give more input or give more access to the subnational governments. And in the UK, they don't want to see us get involved to any great extent in the European discussions, the European debate. So the UK space is opening up. The European space is opening up. And of course, another space exists now, which is affecting America as much as anywhere in Europe, and that's globalization. But at its most simple, globalization is just the intensification of economic activity. That's one narrow view, which I like because the rest of it can get bogged down in a lot of academia. But what it means is that we live in a press-button society. We live in a knowledge society. We live with radical revolution in communications, the internet being part of that. Now, who would have thought 10 or 15 years ago that you could press buttons and be sending messages that would appear instantly in Japan or China or anywhere in the world? It's a revolution. It's change. We may not like some of the changes, but of course we have to deal with them in particular ways. Some see them as opportunities, some see them as threats. But the globalization space for me is that I would like to see Scotland develop a new concept. Yes, there's a country, small country on that map of the world, but I like the idea of Scotland being a concept, Scotland being an idea. So no matter where you are, Scottishness, being a descendant Scot, can be relevant. But there are no boundaries now, there are no barriers. And this is why political spaces are becoming important. What is the barrier or boundary between Scotland and England? Between Scotland and Europe? Between Scotland and any other country in the world? None. It's a new mindset. And I think in Scotland we well see that this is happening, but I think the way forward for devolution, the way forward for Scotland, is to actually accelerate our thinking and grasp some of the implications of all of that. The other point that I wanted to stress, of course, is that there's very much a social dimension to Scotland. We have been in business for a long time. 1,000 years of history are celebrated in Edinburgh Castle. But there is a social agenda, And I'd like to describe this as a new space as well. If you look at Scandinavian countries, which are very similar in geography, topography, and some history with Scotland, there is a quality of life issue. There is a social community issue where they spend lots of taxpayers' money, much more than you guys do, much more than we do in Scotland or the United Kingdom. But there is a different attitude towards quality of life. And again, it's a space that I'd like Scotland to occupy more by looking at some of the things in Scotland like our poor health record. And in 1911, every ship that floated on the planet was made in Glasgow. There was a legacy for that. It was called asbestos. We had massive steel community. We have no steel. We had a massive coal community. We have no coal. We had a massive shipbuilding. We have very little shipbuilding left. But all of that left a legacy in terms of poor health. We are a country of poor diet. We are a country where in terms of cancer, respiratory diseases and heart diseases, we lead the world, sadly from the wrong end. So in facing up to the idea of a world-class country, there are many things in Scotland that we have to internally face up to. And that is why the Parliament in its first 7 or 8 years has invested heavily in health, knowing that at the end of the day there are many things to catch up on. So ladies and gentlemen, this new concept of Scotland looks at all these political spaces and tries to think in a much more imaginative and a much more ambitious way of how we could actually move forward. Now, in that sense, what are more specifically the issues that the modern Scotland should be looking at in terms of the 21st century? Well, first of all, in terms of devolution itself, my case, which tries to straddle the views of both the separatists and the status quo people in London, is to argue that, of course, devolution is a journey. We're going to move forward. The Parliament will want to have more powers. But to use the modern thinking, we have to have them evidence-based. No longer will the public tolerate the kind of idle rhetoric that separates often the Democrats and the Republicans here. Often the political debate is like the country doesn't exist. It exists for the benefit of the two parties. In your case, the Republicans, Democrats. In Scotland, it can be the SNP and Labour. I think what people are looking for and saying, yes, we have the Parliament, we're proud of the achievements. But if you want to go further, don't get bogged down in ideology and beliefs and values of a bygone age or a mystique about political policies that never existed. What we need to do is to work out what Scotland needs in terms of powers and move accordingly forward. That, I think, is the best way. And if we do that, we will not only have some political consensus in Scotland, but we'll also be able to impact on the Westminster government to a much larger extent. But the other thing, ladies and gentlemen, about devolution is it's perched precariously in a Westminster bill, a Westminster piece of legislation. The Scottish Parliament can technically be abolished with a one-line clause in a one-line bill in the House of Commons in London. We don't have a written constitution in the UK. We don't have a constitution in Scotland. There are no safeguards for devolution. So I think apart from looking at the journey, looking at new ideas in terms of powers we need, we also need to be looking very closely at this question of how we can constitutionally safeguard the Parliament and the whole concept of devolution. The second area where I think we need to be moving is this whole question of demography in Scotland and also dependency. The Blair government has attempted to move the UK from a position where there was massive public ownership to a position where there was less dependency for families and individuals on the state. If I give you one example, in the United Kingdom, 40% of GDP goes to the public sector, but in Scotland, 50% of the GDP goes to the public sector. There is a question of dependency. If there's a problem, always look to government. Why should that be? That doesn't happen in America. It doesn't happen in other countries. And I believe as part of this confidence-building issue in Scotland, dependency is an issue that we've got to look at. But the other more worrying thing is demography. There are many countries in Europe now that are losing population. And an interesting projection suggests that America might go in the next by 2050 from something like 300 to 450 million Americans. We're already 450. And on similar projections, we could be going down to less than 400 million over that particular period. Our workforce in Scotland is shrinking. Our population is ageing. And these demographic issues are leading us to new thinking. And part of that new thinking is one of the impacts of this new space. Enlargement of Europe means that the countries of the former Central Eastern European part of the Soviet Union are now coming to Scotland. We have a lot of Polish workers, Latvians, Estonians coming to Scotland. It's a good mix. It's a rich mix. We should be welcoming them. But on the other hand, in Scotland, like most other countries, when you have a mass influx of immigrants, there's always questions asked. And we've got to manage that very, very carefully. The third thing that I think which is vital for me, and this comes back to the economy, that over the last decade, for the Blair government and for Scotland, you measure a country's success in productivity and competitiveness, in growth, business formation, research and innovation. And on all those fronts, we've been doing okay, but it's been just okay. And one of the reasons why I'd like to think that we promote more powers in Scotland is for the economy. We don't have any separate fiscal powers in Scotland. We do have a clause in the bill which allows us to raise income tax by plus or minus 3%. But it's a power we can't use, because no one in Scotland would want to put themselves at a competitive disadvantage relative to any other part of the United Kingdom. So we've got to think through what extra powers might help us to do what they're doing in Ireland, is to facilitate greater economic improvement and greater change. That may be one of the areas that the new Parliament after May of next year may want to address. So a powerful economy is necessary if we want to have a powerful country. But all these areas, ladies and gentlemen, are areas and measurements, criteria, which need to be improved over the period ahead. So I think if we structure the way forward for Scotland, yes, it is safeguarding our constitution. Yes, it is building on the Parliament. Yes, it is about more powers. Yes, it is about addressing economic issues. Yes, it is about creating a better, higher quality social space. But it's also about this mindset that I referred to earlier. I find it hard to believe that I live in a country that often lacks self-belief and often lacks confidence. Because we don't need to when we look around our nation, look at the resources and the assets and the history that we've got. But there is something in Scotland which is about not taking risks. And if you're successful, there must be some question mark over why you've got that success. We have this phrase in Scotland that some people may recognise. It's called, "We're all Jock Tamson's bairns." Now, an English translation would be, "We're all John Thompson's children." But the main thrust of the comment is, don't get above yourself. We're all part of the same set. And the other phrase, of course, in Scotland is, "I kent your father," which is basically, "I know your dad." And what that means is, you may be a superstar, but your father was something else. So just don't get above yourself. They're toothy, trite little comments about my country, but they are powerful, powerful restraints on the self-confidence, self-belief that we need to build. Progress is being made on that front, but you can have all the resources in the world, all the talent, you can grasp all the opportunities, but unless you have the self-confidence to see it through, things, in fact, could be very, very difficult. Can I just move very briefly then to talk about what I regard as the kind of purple patch for Scotland, which was the Enlightenment period. Now, the Enlightenment was something quite remarkable. I referred earlier in a kind of jocular way, putting my bias aside, about the achievements of that period. But they were absolutely stunning in terms of a poor country on the periphery of Europe, a country that had lost its parliament in 1707. Then from 1740 onwards, an astonishing outpouring of creativity, innovation, ideas that did genuinely shape the world. I don't think for a minute we can recreate any one other point in history, a period that went before us. That would be foolish, it would be silly. But on the other hand, there seems to me something inspiring that a period in our own history can be taken and used to suggest that maybe a new Enlightenment post-devolution is something that Scotland needs. Maybe a different kind of Enlightenment. in a different context, with modern communications, modern technology. But nevertheless, when you look at the economy of Scotland, we are a world leader in medical research and biosciences. We now, between Glasgow and Edinburgh, have the 15th largest financial services sector in the world. We have a tourism industry that generates more than $6 billion. I'm not supposed to say it in a place like this, but we also have another drink that not many people should know about here that generates another $6 billion worth of exports every year. But you know, the big strength of Scotland is still its learning. We live in a knowledge society. Learning is going to be key. Learning will be the tool that opens up opportunities for individuals, for communities, and for nations. And it seems to me that when you look at the past, but look at the assets I've described, we can only go forward. But it needs those ingredients that I've described to get us there. So I just believe that Scotland, the idea, Scotland, the concept, can build on all of that. But the main thing is that having a parliament and having devolution is not of itself the solution to every problem we've ever faced in the last 300 years. But what it should be doing is giving us a dynamic, a new space, a new set of spaces in which we can be different, we can be bolder. And my challenge to the politicians is that we have to think at a different level. We've got to realise as a subnational government, as a proud nation, we should be thinking differently. Let's not be tied to the thinking at Westminster. Let's look to the European scene. Let's look to the global scene. And I believe if we do that, then we can engage in this globalised world, have the successes I've talked about, and fulfil the early dreams of devolution at the start of the 19th century, where Keir Hardie, the leader of my own party, the Labour Party, had this vision of home rule for Scotland. And may I say that in the same manifesto, he also wanted an alcohol-free Scotland. We've got our parliament, but I don't think we'll ever see an alcohol-free Scotland. But Keir Hardie, the initial founders, they wanted that vision to come true. I think we're well served in Scotland now and well placed to go further in getting the dreams that they dreamt of into harsh reality and indeed to improve the quality of life of my country. Thanks very much, ladies and gentlemen.